Okay.
Welcome, friends. We have a talk today on soul memory. But before we get started on that, a student is going to summarize the 3 fundamental propositions that are found in the Secret Doctrine, and these ideas just underlie the entire philosophy. So it's just a way to sort of touch on them before we get into the talk.
Thanks. The Secret Doctrine outlines 3 fundamental propositions. The first is an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, immutable, absolute principle. She calls it Parabrahm. This is beyond human conception. The second is that the universe is a cyclical manifestation of endless universes appearing and disappearing. She calls these sparks of eternity. Within this absolute. The third is the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul, she calls it, and requiring a spiritual pilgrimage through cycles of reincarnation and according to karmic law. The absolute principle is the single ultimate reality, Sat or Parabrahm, unchanging infinite beingness, she calls it, that precedes all manifestation. It's beyond thought, it's the source of all existence. The cyclical universe proposition states that the cosmos is an eternal, periodic playground where countless universes manifest and dissolve, like breaths or sparks of eternity within the greater cosmic cycle. She calls those days and nights of Brahm. And then universal brotherhood and reincarnation is the third proposition. Every soul is a spark of the universal oversoul, destined to undergo a long journey of incarnation and reincarnation to evolve, guided by karma, and ultimately returning to that source. So these 3 propositions form the bedrock of the theosophical philosophy. They connect the divine and the cosmos and the human soul through these universal laws of consciousness cycles and spiritual evolution.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments on these?
Just a very quick question, or maybe comments. The first fundamental talks about absolute. So that includes, if we look at the universe, that'll include both the manifest and unmanifest, right? Some universes are awake like ours right now, and some are in pralayas. So I'm assuming that absolute will include all of that.
Absolutely. No pun intended. But yeah, that's the idea, right? Is that there is this unknowable state, even to say that it's absolute, because it is neither absolute nor is it concrete. It's neither abstract nor it's none of these things that words can actually describe it. These are just the words she uses that help bring us closer to an understanding of it. It's not going to be fully understood by the ratiocinative mind, right? Any reasoning mind is going to be limited by the fact that it's a mind. It's something that could only be fully understood by the soul, something beyond mind. But these are the words she uses to approach the topic. So it's definitely precedes manifestation and the manifest and the unmanifest.
Okay.
In the student's understanding of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is another sort of comment or question. It's because it's absolute and it's devoid of attributes. It's without any relation to manifested being. But I don't know. Sometimes with absolutes, one can say the opposite as well. It must also be the container of all attributes, all possible attributes. I guess it's just not active. But couldn't we just say also that it is, if we can say it's devoid of all attributes and without any relation, isn't it also full of all attributes and completely related.
It is both all of these things and none of these things. It perhaps betrays one's deeper understanding of it, or it makes the deeper understanding of it difficult if we think of it in terms of having attributes, even thinking of it in terms of having all attributes. One cannot say that it is or is not any of these things. But when we use certain language, it facilitates the opening of our mind to the wider possibility of what it could be. These are all very vague statements, right? But to think of it as having attributes is perhaps making it more difficult for the mind to grasp its true nature. We're trying to coach the mind into a collaboration with the Buddhic principle, because it's at that level of Buddhi that we'll fully understand it. And if you think of the absolute as having attributes, all attributes, you're not wrong. You're just further from its true concept. You're further from a Buddhic understanding of it, because you've contextualized it in a way that may be just somewhat distracting from what HPB is trying to do. I think the reason HPB uses these terms, like beingness, that doesn't mean that it isn't being, because it isn't, and it is both nothing and all things, right? It's assigning any kind of language to it is going to make it more difficult to understand. But this is how we communicate. This is how we learn. These are the conditions of our classroom. So using the approach that HPB gives us is to think of it as without attributes. Somehow, for whatever reason, that seems closer to a Buddhic understanding of this concept. Every student should decide for themselves what helps them to understand it. I remember many years ago reading about a sect of Gnostic Christians from the American Midwest. They have a like commune out there, and they drew a lot from Blavatsky, a lot from the theosophical literature, but they made this distinction in that the absolute was akin to their personal God, because if it's truly absolute, it was sort of the same point the previous student was making, that if it's absolute, then it must include a personality. It must have one, because to say that it doesn't have it would take something away from it, and you can't take something away from the absolute. It's an interesting argument. HPB didn't put it in those terms, and I think it was in order to help encourage our minds to take the most Buddhic approach that our minds are capable of taking, and bring us a little bit closer to a Buddhic understanding of it, versus the mental gymnastics required to include a personal God in the absolute. Right? So, just some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. It was interesting.
Yeah, it reminds me of the statement Krishna makes in the Gita that all things are in me, but I'm not in them. So, absolute can be, as you said, beingness and being, attributes and non-attributes, all encapsulated in what we conceive and try to conceive in abstract terms what absolute is. So.
Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, I'm going to do a short reading from The Voice of the Silence. That which is uncreated abides in thee, disciple, as it abides in that hall. If thou wouldst reach it and blend the two, thou must divest thyself of thy dark garments of illusion. Stifle the voice of flesh. Allow no image of the senses to get between its light and thine, that thus the twain may blend in one. And having learnt thine own ajnana, flee from the hall of learning. This hall is dangerous in its perfidious beauty. is needed but for thy probation. Beware, Lanu, lest dazzled by elusive radiance, thy soul should linger and be caught in its deceptive light. This light shines from the jewel of the great ensnarer, Mara. The senses it bewitches, blinds the mind, and leaves the unwary an abandoned wreck. The moth attracted to the dazzling flame of thy night lamp is doomed to perish in the viscid oil. The unwary soul that fails to grapple with the mocking demon of illusion will return to earth, the slave of Mara. Behold the hosts of souls. Watch how they hover over the stormy sea of human life, and how exhausted, bleeding, broken-winged, they drop one after the other on the swelling waves. Tossed by the fierce winds, chased by the gale, they drift into the eddies and disappear within the first great vortex. If, through the hall of wisdom, thou wouldst reach the veil of bliss, disciple, close fast thy senses against the great dire heresy of separateness that weans thee from the rest. Okay, and now a talk on soul memory. And I'm going to share some slides, and hopefully it'll work great this time. And here we go. Does everyone see the title, Soul Memory?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, in the dialogue of Socrates and Meno, Plato presents the idea that all learning is recollection, a recollection of knowledge the soul already possesses from previous lives. In the dialogue with Meno, he says, quote, "The soul is immortal and has been born many times. There is nothing it has not learned. Therefore, learning is simply recollection," unquote. To illustrate this in the dialogue, Socrates calls over an uneducated slave boy, and through questioning leads the boy to discover a geometrical truth without having been taught it in the conventional sense. In the dialogue, this demonstration shows that the boy already knew the geometric truth, but had simply forgotten it. The process of learning is thus one of recovering latent knowledge. By examining many things and asking deep questions about them and their relationship to similar objects, we can come to remember what we've already known, even if it wasn't formally taught to us in this life. Importantly, Plato's method is through questioning rather than teaching or preaching, and thus he leads the student to self-discovery. H.P. Blavatsky draws deeply on this Platonic view of the soul and education. And here, education means drawing out, not filling one up with facts. This is also the method used in The Secret Doctrine. In this great work, HPB talks about how the higher ego in man, the Atma-Buddhi-Manas, contains the accumulated wisdom of our past lives. True spiritual development is the recollection and reintegration of higher knowledge that we already possess but don't have immediate waking access to. Like the boy in Plato's dialogue with Meno, we already know this knowledge, but we must awaken awareness of the knowledge through discipline and inner work, by searching and asking questions. Are you seeing the slide that says the soul already knows?
Yes.
Yes.
Just want to double check. So through that dialogue and other dialogues, Plato affirms that the soul is immortal, has been born many times, and seen all things. Learning is not acquiring new knowledge, but recollecting what the soul already knew from a past existence. This is possible because the soul is akin to truth and reality, and knowledge is innate to the soul. Plato implies that the soul's descent into the body causes it to forget its true nature, and the study of philosophy and metaphysics helps it to recover its divine memory. In Theosophy, this idea is paralleled in the teaching that the higher ego is the true spiritual self in man. This ego persists across incarnations, carrying the fruits of experience and the potential for spiritual realization. The higher ego is the sole bearer of all the karma of the person, the only one who reincarnates and is rewarded or punished from the secret doctrine. Similarly, this is stated in the Key to Theosophy, where HPB says that the mind is the storehouse of all past impressions. And this storehouse parallels Plato's concept that the soul retains latent memory of all it is known. And Plato basically says that there is nothing to prevent a man from learning, or rather recollecting, all knowledge. He says, since then the soul is immortal and has been born many times, since it has seen all things both in this world and in the other, there is nothing it has not learned. No wonder then that it is able to recall to mind goodness and other things, for it knew them beforehand. For as all reality is akin to the soul, and the soul has learned all things, there is nothing to prevent a man who has recalled, or as people say, learnt, only one thing from discovering all the rest for himself, if he will pursue the search with unwearying resolution. For on this showing, all inquiry or learning is nothing but recollection. It seems to us, however, that soul knowledge can be difficult to recover. There is not one tried and true way to access it all at once. Mr. Crosby discusses real memory in his book, Universal Theosophy. To reach into and exercise soul memory, we must first understand the real nature of man. We must first see that all beings of every grade are of the same essence, the same spirit, the same life, and of the same potential powers. Higher beings, such as adepts and Mahatmas, have brought these potential powers into activity and differ from the lower orders by reason of a greater degree of development, a greater range of perception, and a finer evolution of form. But the highest as well as the lowest are all rays from and one with the divine absolute principle. Each one is the perceiver who stands in the center of his own universe, through which alone we may know all that may be known of the highest. We must also recognize the fact that this is a universe of law. There are no accidents anywhere in it, and we have arrived at our present position under law, the law of our own being, set into operation by ourselves. The same law rules in every direction in space and in nature and on all beings equally. The races of men that now exist are the result of races of men which preceded them. The planet on which we now live is the result of a planet that preceded it. The solar system of which our planet is a part is the result of a solar system that preceded it. Everything is an exact consequence of that which preceded it. Everything is a repetition of that which was. This return of the same action or preceding impression occurs under the true aspect of memory. It is the memory of what we have been through that brings about the repetition. In every act of our existence, we are exhibiting true memory, whether we realize it or not. The memory of walking is with us now. The memory of talking is with us now. We may not remember how nor when we learned to walk or to talk, but we have present within us the knowledge of knowing how to walk and how to talk. True memory is just that, the possession of the knowledge of the past. It is memory which connects us physically with the body through all the changes of body, scene, and circumstance. Without that knowledge, we should be living merely from impression to impression, and there would be no connection at all with the past, and there would be no sense of self-identity. Memory also exists in the inner departments of our nature. Living on the physical plane, our ideas are connected almost entirely with the three-dimensional state of matter. We are no more conscious of those inner planes of being than when in sleep, we are conscious of the physical plane, being absolutely shut off from the outside world, from the happenings to our friends and family, to the nation, and to the world at large, which are of no consequence to us while we're in that dream state. Yet there is an active life in those inner departments of our nature, and there is a memory of it. The thinker who uses the brain in the waking state is simply acting on another plane of matter and using another plane of memory. Every plane of consciousness essentially has a memory of its own. It's important to note also that our consciousness never ceases. It is continuously active. We may be aware that sleep or death is coming for the body, but we know those states only as we see them in others because they're not objective to ourselves. When we say, "I was asleep," we mean that the body was in the sleeping state, while we ourselves passed altogether from this plane to the inner planes for the time being. Then we passed back again from the inner planes to this plane, picking up the memory of the waking state where we laid it down, and leaving behind the memory of what passed on the other side. There is no record made in this physical instrument, the body, of the inner planes, for the brain has not been trained in that direction, and hence it can't translate those planes of consciousness, except in some partial recollections such as occur in dreams. Dreams attest that we are alive and active on the inner planes. For in them we think, we speak, we smell, taste, hear, and move as individuals, and never have any question as to our identity, even though the personality presented should be that of some past incarnation. The dreaming state is very close to the point of waking. It's like an intermediate state between waking and sleeping, so that we are able to impress the brain cells with what has occurred right before waking and remember it. But beyond the dreaming stage and dreamless sleep, which is a very short stage of sleep, there is a vast extent of human thought and action. We go in and in until we are close to the source of our own being, where the thinker is at work and where he knows all that he has seen before, all that he has been before, all his past incarnations, where he sees and knows himself as he truly is. The memory of all the experience through which he has been as an individualized being is there in one consecutive whole. That indeed was the paradise of man when he walked alongside the deity, when he knew himself as he really was. True memory is the paradise which all human beings should strive to regain. To recover that whole memory, to make that great knowledge of the past usable here and now in the brain and in the body, is the true work of salvation. Only when we understand what we really are, that we shall be able to take a conscious, active, purposeful part in the evolution of our race. Only when we gain the perception that we are the eternal spirit, that death never touches us at all, that we may have a conscious life in spirit, not in matter. Only when we begin to think and act from that basis can true memory come through to the brain, and only then can we know for ourselves. That true memory is possible for every living being. The barrier for every man is not in the memory, but in the false ideas of life according to which he acts while in the waking state. However much the soul remembers, if we are using the brain contrary to the nature of the soul, the brain cannot translate its impressions. The thinker must transfer the memory of the soul to the brain, and he can only do so by thinking and acting along the right lines during active waking consciousness, until the brain responds to the ideas and learns to transmit what occurs while the body is inoperative. then the true memory of the past that is in the soul becomes our knowledge in the brain. The masters are those who have the true memory of every step through which they have gone, the knowledge of all past civilizations, the understanding of all that every human being has to experience, the recognition of all the laws ruling evolution. As custodians of that knowledge and as our elder brothers, they stand ready to help mankind in the only way open to them, by that of recording as much of that knowledge as possible and offering it to us for us to assimilate, and by directing us to its proper use for the benefit to ourselves and to all other human beings, so that humanity may advance in an orderly way to the true goal. The objects of evolution are a greater and greater individualization and a wider and wider range of perception. But there are two paths by which we may reach that goal. One path leads to an individualization that is based on the personality, selfish and self-righteous, a state of separateness from all other human beings. The other path leads to more and more individualization based on the higher principles, where each one is sui generis. The elder brother goes as high as he can, but he stops before he enters the final door of nirvana that separates him from the rest of toiling mankind. He returns and takes up again a body of the race, as Jesus did, as Buddha did, that he may help those who know still less than he does. So we're never truly alone, and never will there come a time when those great beings will cease from that labor, which is a labor of love. But we are the ones who must determine for ourselves sooner or later whether we go on through eons of suffering and millions of lives of ignorance, possibly, or to follow the path they show, which leads straight to the goal, which involves the power of direct cognition of truth and remembering all that we have learned from our past lives. And this includes real memory. In further breaking down memory, we come to what HPB has said in the Key to Theosophy, namely that memory is an innate power in thinking beings, and even in animals, of reproducing past impressions by an association of ideas, principally suggested by objective things or by some action on our external sensory organs. Memory is a faculty depending entirely on the more or less healthy and normal functioning of the physical brain. And remembrance and recollection are the attributes and handmaidens of that memory. So when an idea again recurs without the operation of the like object on the external sensory, it is remembrance. If it be sought after by the mind and with pain and endeavor found and brought again into view, it is recollection. Theosophy also says that memory can be considered simply fantasy and the most unreliable thing in us. How many misremember and embellish their memories? Ammonius Saccas asserted that the only faculty in man directly opposed to prognostication or looking into the future is memory, because we're so used to thinking of how things were always done. Furthermore, remember that memory is one thing and mind or thought is another. One is a recording machine, a register which very easily gets out of order. The other, thoughts, are eternal and imperishable. Would you refuse to believe in the existence of certain things or men only because your physical eyes have not seen them? Would not the collective testimony of past generations who have seen him be a sufficient guarantee that Julius Caesar once lived? Why should not the same testimony of the psychic senses of the masses be taken into consideration? Even in the short span of ordinary existence, memory is usually too weak to register all the events of a lifetime. How frequently do even the most important events lie dormant in our memory until awakened by some association of ideas or aroused to function an activity by some other link. This is especially the case of people with advanced age who are always found suffering from feebleness of recollection. When therefore we remember that which we know about the physical and the spiritual principles in man, it is not the fact that our memory has failed to record our precedent life and lives that ought to surprise us, but the contrary, that we might remember everything and all their details were it to happen. But reminiscence, the next topic, is an entirely different thing from remembrance and recollection. Reminiscence has no faculty like the brain or attribute of our physical memory, but it is an intuitional perception apart from and outside of our physical brain. It's a perception which, covering as it does all those visions in man which are regarded as abnormal, from the pictures suggested by genius to the ravings of fever and even madness, are classed by science as having no existence outside our fancy. Occultism and Theosophy, however, regard reminiscence in an entirely different light. For us, while memory is physical and evanescent and depends on the physiological conditions of the brain, we call reminiscence the memory of the soul. And it is this memory which gives the assurance to almost every person, whether he understands it or not, of his having lived before and having to live again. As Wordsworth wrote, "We do not deny that such visions of the past and glimpses far back into the corridors of time are not abnormal, as contrasted with our normal daily life experience and physical memory. But we do maintain that the absence of memory of any action done in a previous state cannot be a conclusive argument against our having lived through it." So why do we not remember our past lives? How do the 7 principles account for our complete loss of any recollection of having lived before? The Theosophist answers this query very easily. Since those principles, which we call physical, are disintegrated after death along with their constituent elements, memory along with the brain, the vanished memory of a vanished personality can neither remember nor record anything in the subsequent reincarnation of the ego. Reincarnation means that this ego will be furnished with a new body, a new brain, and a new memory. Therefore, it would be as absurd to expect this memory to remember that which has never recorded, as it would be idle to examine under a microscope a shirt never worn by a murderer and seek on it for the stains of blood which are to be found only on the clothes he wore. It is not the clean shirt we have to question, but the clothes worn during the perpetration of the crime, so to speak. And if these are burnt and destroyed, how can you get at them? What are those clothes? The physical and psychic garments left behind by the ego after death, while the higher ego passes into the devaconic state. What is left behind is only the reflection of the personality, or the skandhas, also known as attributes, of the previous incarnation. What are the skandhas? There are 5 of them, and briefly they are the rupa, form or matter, body and senses, or the material qualities. Vedana, sensations or feelings, whether pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Sana, abstract ideas, perception, or recognition. Samkara, tendencies of mind, mental formations, volitions, and tendencies. And lastly, Vijnana, mental powers and consciousness. By these, we are conscious of existence, and through these skandhas, we communicate with the world about us. These are impermanent and are not the self with a capital S. These are the components of the personality, and they're ever changing with every new birth. It's only the part played by the actor, the true ego, for one night. This is why we perceive no memory on the physical plane of our past lives, though the real ego has lived them over and knows them all. The skandhas are also considered agents of karma because they do not die immediately with the body, but they impress themselves upon the subtler principles forming the seed of the next personality. They cause the man or woman to be reborn and help shape the next life and its destiny. These aggregates are impressed on the new personality, causing the man or woman to involuntarily take up and continue the self-same line of life and thought as in the previous existence. In other words, the skandhas form the outward and inward appearance of the man. The skandhas, however, also bear upon the tendencies, desires, and mental habits, sometimes also called karmic residues. And these are like the causal links between lives. These residues impress the psychic nature of the man, or they could be considered psychic imprints that help shape the conditions of the next life. They are not immortal, but they are like carriers of karma, and they help link that line of thought and habit from life to life. So while the higher ego persists, the skandhas dissolve and reform in each incarnation, reassembling in ways determined by karmic law. H.P. Blavatsky adds that desire, tied to kama, the principle of desire, is a powerful skandha that survives death and draws the soul back into rebirth, especially when the personality clings to an earthly identity. This sort of idea is echoed in the Voice of the Silence, where the aspirant is encouraged to kill out desire, kill love of life. But if thou slayest tanha, let this not be for thirst of life eternal. Here, tanha, or thirst for life, or the desire of life, becomes the womb from which rebirth arises. If skandhas are like memories bound to the form and to the lower man, then back to reminiscence, that is the memory of the formless. Reminiscence is soul memory not accessed by the brain or desire so much as through spiritual discipline, inner stillness, and the awakening of Buddhi-Manas. Plato echoed this when he said that the soul recollects the forms when it turns away from sense objects and looks inward. Reminiscence, to return to it in this context, again, is the direct perception of truth and inner knowledge. If we take the point of view of the soul, that is the real person, then we see that this memory is veiled from the personality. It is shut out from waking consciousness. The soul knows the truth, but when it descends into incarnation, it becomes veiled by those skandhas, which obscure the memory. Here, the lower manas, which is the seat of the skandhas and the desires, veils the higher ego's innate knowledge. In the Voice of the Silence, when the aspirant slays the slayer, the light of Buddhi-Manas shines through and remembrance arises, not of personality, but of the self, the true man, the ego, the reincarnating man. The self in this context includes all the soul has known in prior existences. When meditation, service, and ethical living are engaged in creating an alignment, soul memory becomes possible. This is spiritual psychology and relates to the path of initiation. It isn't a sudden event, but a gradual unfolding. This memory is not available to the personal mind unless that mind is purified, refined, and aligned with the spiritual will. Purification, discrimination, meditation, silence. This is not a rigid checklist, but a consistent structure we find across theosophical teachings, about recovering the memory of the soul. The following could be like a simplified model of the stages of soul awakening. The first is recognition of inner duality. The aspirant begins to sense that the personality is not the true self, that there is something higher, watching, waiting, knowing. This is what Mr. Judge calls the moment when a man begins to seek knowledge of the higher self and to know that he is dual. The witness consciousness begins to stir. The second stage is purification of the lower nature. Without quieting the skandhas, the habitual desires, attachments, and mental distractions, no recollection is possible. And this is the inner work: ethics, self-observation, detachment, and the conscious transmutation of desire. As it is said in the Voice of the Silence, the self of matter and the self of spirit can never meet. One of the twain must disappear. And this stage is where Kama-Manas is gradually withdrawn from the senses and begins to rise upwards towards Buddhi-Manas. 3 is deepening of silence and inner stillness. As the lower mind becomes calmed, there opens a subtle inner space in which the voice of the higher ego can be faintly heard. HPB said, only when the disciple has learned to silence the mind can the true voice of the soul be heard. In this silence, reminiscence begins. Not memory in the usual sense, but there can be like sudden knowings, recognitions, flashes of intuitive truth. The soul does not remember things, but it has these flashes of that which is eternal. 4, the next stage is awakening of the intuition, which is Buddhi-Manasic activity. At this stage, the aspirant begins to experience direct perception of truth. So not just in sudden flashes, but in longer periods of time. And not abstractly, but through inner realizations. This is what HPB called the flame that burns in the secret chamber of the heart, or what Patanjali called prajna, spiritual perception. Thou shalt hear the voice of the silence and learn that no mortal tongue can utter. The knowledge of the self is the fruit of selflessness and truth. The real knowledge remembered here is of the eternal truths of unity, the nature of karma and the self, the lessons of past lives as vibrations, and the intercontinuity of the soul's pilgrimage. So in that stage, there's like a lot of inner perception and work that goes on. And then 5th is inner union and integration. As this awakening deepens, the lower manas becomes united with the higher, and the duality between them dissolves. Mr. Judge says that when the lower manas is drawn upward and merges with the higher, the ego begins to illuminate the personality. This is not the end of development, but it marks the beginning of self-conscious spiritual living guided from within. The memory of the soul becomes one's compass, and our ethical choices begin to align with that innate spiritual identity. Here are some of the signs and effects of awakening soul memory. They don't all appear as dramatic insights. Sometimes it comes in subtle forms, such as a deep sense of recognition when encountering a teaching or a symbol. A quiet conviction of truth, even without external evidence. A spontaneous insight during meditation or a moment of stillness. An increase in compassion, clarity, and fearlessness. A gradual disinterest in external validation and a turn inwards. These are not memories of facts, but awakenings of meaning. The true memory is the soul's recollection of its own divine nature and of the one life that runs through all of existence. It is a real capacity latent in each human being to awaken to the deeper truths of past lives, universal law, and our collective spiritual origins. So to finish and to wrap up and remind where we began with, Plato said in Phaedrus, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, the soul, having dwelt among the gods where it beheld the forms of truth, beauty, and justice before it fell into a physical body, can be understood through this phrase. The soul is like an exile who remembers dimly the land of his birth. And in Phaedo, he says, the soul that is pure departs to the invisible world, to the divine and immortal and rational place, and lives in truth through all of eternity. And that concludes the talk portion. And we'll just open it up for questions and comments.
Excellent talk, Kathy. Thank you. Quick question. So, is soul memory the same as spiritual or higher intuition? And because in Theosophy, we are taught that true intuition is when the individual instantly recalls all that is to be known. Is that same or is it different?
Yeah, it seems to this student that that intuition is the same or very similar to reminiscence, where there's direct perception of truth. It doesn't have to go through the ratiocinative mind from A to B to C. It just like penetrates and all of that becomes understood at once. And it seems that intuition is the same as reminiscence, that direct access. It's just that for us, where we are now in our development, that might be an occasional experience. But the more we unite with the higher mind and awaken buddhi, live ethically and follow those precepts by, like the Mahatmas, the more that awareness grows, those perceptions become more frequent, more sustained. And then eventually, as it was said, that becomes the guide of the soul, as opposed to the physical, our perceptions of just this three-dimensional realm. The inner world becomes much more vibrant, much more like alive, awake. There's no barriers to time. Becomes awareness of subtler planes of consciousness, like the astral, and that ultimately the Akashic records will be, one can access and open up that storehouse of all knowledge. So yeah, it's really a process, but it's all within us, and we have the key. We have to do the work ourselves to unlock it.
Yeah, thank you.
In science, we learn, there's been experiments in psychology that when we remember things, we make things up. Like the brain fills in gaps and conflates things and just outright misremembers things. Is this an influence of skandhas? Is this just like a byproduct of sort of skandhic memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it would seem it's a combination of the, you know, the brain, the lower mind, which would be Kama-Manas. And, you know, the brain has the power to recognize patterns and make associations. And sometimes when it's missing something, it just kind of fills it in. Certainly the skandhas would bear upon that quite a bit. We influence, obviously between lives, we influence the skandhas. So someone who does a lot of sort of inner work and focus on metaphysics and compassion, altruistic living is going to sort of change the vibratory rate, the quality of the skandhas between lives, and that's going to help with that, maintaining that upward trajectory. But certainly it seems like in preparing for this, the student learned that the skandhas are like, they work with karma since they're agents of karma. So yeah, if the brain isn't working optimally, it's going to fall back on the tendencies already established. So yeah, the skandhas are part of that for sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I remember some, I don't know if it's psychology or neurology, sort of like experiment. Someone had the corpus callosum severed, which is between the two sides of the brain, and they had him cover one eye and showed him something orange, and it showed him a school bus, and he was supposed to make a relationship, and he said an orange. And it's like, that's part of it. They are both the same color, but it's just an association. It wasn't like a complete transference from, you know, the brain wasn't functioning 100% properly, but it still kind of limped along and could transfer associations, but it was very incomplete. And that sort of could maybe be an example of what the lower mind is in contrast to the higher mind in relation to like knowledge of the soul. We just have these like glimpses and makes associations and kind of limp along, but we haven't really connected everything, connected all the dots like one would with a full understanding. You were going to say something. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I think of so many things as you're talking. One is that the brain seems to be incapable of allowing gaps or inconsistencies, that it has to, like if I say, you know, imagine a school bus that's in the shape of an orange, immediately everybody's minds picture a school bus in the shape of an orange. Like our brain is like, oh, okay, I'll think of that. It doesn't reject something because it's nonsensical. And it reminds me of the way AI works, like artificial intelligence works now. If you give it an insane prompt to create an image from, it will come up with something. It will never say, I'm sorry, this doesn't make any sense, I can't do this. The brain never says, I can't imagine that. It always fills in something. It's incapable of allowing there to be just gaps. I guess interesting.
I think because of the brain is, you know, really responsive. It is an amazing instrument. We're just not aware of how it could be tuned to a much finer quality to become porous to these metaphysical and soul truths. But if someone was to lead us through questioning, like the dialogue between Socrates and Meno, or as kind of HPV does in the style, the way the Secret Doctrine was written, it helps to awaken those suggestions so we arrive at conclusions ourselves, because we already know them, we've just forgotten them, and we need sort of that awakening process to start. And then the mind can be very responsive. It's obviously only as good as it can be in any one life due to hereditary factors or health and wellness and things like that. But in general, the brain is a willing and always active instrument. And depending on which way you direct it, it will it will respond.
Interesting. I find the conversation really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. To think that we struggle so much and we have the key. But it's difficult at the same time. It's the most difficult thing to unlock.
I like the terminology you used there too about the brain being tuned and being receptive. Right. This reinforces the idea or the metaphor, if you will, of the brain as like a radio or a television that can be tuned to a particular station and then sort of manifest that output. But it's like when you're watching a television show, it's the people are not inside the box, right? The people are, somewhere else entirely, maybe not even live or real, but the images. We're like if you break the radio, the station is still broadcasting, right? Like the signals are still out there. We're just not always tuned into them. So it's like higher mind is there, Buddhi is there, and it's up to us whether our radios are tuned to that station or not. We can exercise our minds in a way that tunes us into that. But it isn't something that exists inside our head or inside our body. It's not the brain that holds these things. It's true for memory too, as I understand it. Theosophically, memory is like on the Akashic records and not stored in the brain.
I would just add that I think how one uses the brain, because it can obscure the signal. So the signal might be very faint. And harder to tune into.
Yeah, on a TV or a radio, you can detune it so you're hearing it scratchy and with static, and the image maybe not complete. I think that's a similar analogy.
A lot of interference at times.
Yeah.
I wrote a quotation that you only know reality through your senses.
Well, it depends what you call reality. Obviously, the reality that we perceive with our senses is the three-dimensional one around us, and even that's faulty because our senses can be faulty. But beyond the senses, there are higher senses that can be awakened through the mind, and then one will remember the knowledge of the soul, that it's literally obscured by the senses, by the memory we have in this realm. It kind of like takes up a lot of like bandwidth. It's loud, it's right in front of us, so it's hard to tune into those subtler things. And that's why, reviewing, trying to take the 30,000-foot view of what you did that day, like every night before you go to bed, or taking time to read a devotional book or to discuss metaphysics, having some inward time for meditation helps quiet the mind, because it's constantly, as Josh said, it's never not responding. But if we don't guard the mind and sort of return to points of sort of stillness and tending towards the higher, it will just keep going over the lower and making a lot of noise and obscuring the alignment. We have to create that alignment ourselves to make possible the unfolding of soul knowledge. And here, like this student read, it was purification, then discrimination as to what you're receiving, and then meditation and silence. Maybe we should also put silence at the beginning. Silence, purification, discrimination, meditation, silence again. Do you think that, Lenning? I mean, you said that the only reality is of the senses. I mean, hasn't everyone experienced inklings that there's more, something beyond, you know, whether it's through dream or intuition?
There is studies on from the psychology and neuroscience world on extrasensory perception and out-of-body experience and things like that. That's a quote I mentioned that I quoted about the knowing reality for your senses is from Plato, known through him, from his writings, and he learned that from Socrates. But yeah, of course, we know there has been a lot of time has passed since then, and there's a lot more knowledge nowadays. It makes I can see where that quote comes from. I think it's along the lines of the saying that if a tree falls in a forest, did it make a sound? And the answer is that there needs to be an ear to perceive that a sound was made when the tree was falling. If no one was there to listen to it, then maybe there was no sound made. Which is an outside of the box kind of way of analyzing that situation. So meditation enhances introspection when it's done properly, and someone can be more conscientious of your breathing, kind of take more control over what thoughts you enter your mind or you filter out, or how to calm myself down. So there is, for sure, it and it's been shown to help a lot to people. So could there be a higher realm of consciousness that perhaps we have a hard time tapping into? That to me makes sense, but it's gonna be really hard to convince the neuroscience world, the basic science world, because they have a hard time even acknowledging consciousness, how to define it, how is it, how is the phenomenon of consciousness that we know, how is it, even there is still debates on that, let alone on consciousness. That is seen, well, psychology and the topic of consciousness is perceived as not too scientific. So when you go even further away, with Akashic records and the astral plane and things like that, that takes that because it's harder to measure for the standard scientific method. It's harder to measure it. Nonetheless, for me, separating my scientific formation from my esoteric, because I legitimately have studied esoteric sciences for a long time, to me it makes sense. And I do believe that there's more than what the senses perceive.
Yeah, that came up in the part where it said when the accumulated testimony that Julius Caesar lived be convincing enough, why not that also for the psychic? And maybe eventually as humanity progresses and we become more aware of like the astral plane, because we are on this evolutionary trajectory of becoming less material, moving in an ethereal direction, that it said that this will become, you know, known and obvious to everyone at some point. Cyrus, is there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just looking back to the Skandhas. So the Skandhas make up our personalities, and as long as we have Skandhas, we cannot escape the necessity of rebirth, right? So the question is, once you reach a point where you can take a rebirth voluntarily instead of necessity. Is that a point we need to reach where we can start recalling, or reach an awakening state where we start recalling true knowledge?
So is your question what happens when we have purified the skandhas?
Yeah, so but the overarching question is our personality a big obstacle in which personality is made up of skandhas, right? Is that a big obstacle in recalling true memory, true
Yes.
knowledge?
Yes, definitely. The skandhas do include the body and the senses, material qualities, sensations and feelings. And even there are more, some skandhas are less material, tendencies of mind, mental formations, things like that. So I mean, essentially this inward path of purification is purifying the skandhas. And eventually, as the sort of lower mind and desires are transmuted and raised to a higher level, it purifies the skandhas, and eventually there is no need for rebirth. One wouldn't leave these residues that there would be no seed for another rebirth eventually. But it sounds like the Mahatmas have, maybe they're not at that stage, but at the stage of a Buddha where it's a choice to incarnate. I'm not really sure at what level that really occurs. Maybe that is the place where the Mahatmas are at, where they incarnate voluntarily, but they don't leave a karmic residue behind because they are acting as the law of karma in a sense. They're not creating anything that they have to come back to. They are acting in an equilibrating manner. They're not leaving a residue that has to be met in a future life to balance things out. Yeah, so the skandhas are ever changing, and they're like semi-permanent until we transmute them, so to speak. They become the aggregates impressed on the new personality, which is interesting to think, like how that happens, how it impresses the personality to have a certain tendency or bend towards it. And when one takes over the consciousness of the body, it must be after the skandhas have attached themselves, it would seem. But there's a lot to learn on that we only get a little bit of information on, like in the Secret Doctrine and stuff. But it is a really interesting question.
I know we're a little over time. I wanted to make an observation about the quote that was posted in the chat. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, let me check it.
Yeah, it was mentioned already, where it says you only know reality through your senses. I think it might be interesting to turn that around to say that you know only reality through your senses. And by that I mean reality is not what we think it is, right? We have this statement in Theosophy about the voidness of the seeming full and the fullness of the seeming void. And fullness, of course, I think we mean here like the reality. So it's like the reality of what seems, full, and the unreality, or the unreality of what seems full, and the reality of what seems like it's a void. What we experience around us through our senses, we call reality. But that is all we can really know through our senses, is this world around us. But we know from the theosophical literature that that isn't actually reality. Like there is a truer reality, or a less deceptive reality. And so I think the quote is through your senses, you can only know your sensory reality. Perhaps that's just an observation.
Makes sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we can close the meeting now. The recording.